She was 24 years old when she decided to leave her life in the city behind. Not because things were going badly. That's the part nobody understood when she tried to explain it later. Things were going fine. She had a job on the 31st floor of a glass building. She had a lease on a one-bedroom apartment with a view of the lake that had taken 8 months on a waiting list. She had a 5-year plan written in a notes app on her phone, organized by quarter, color-coded by category. She had everything she had moved to the city at 22 to get. And she was sitting at her desk one Tuesday afternoon in October, staring at a spreadsheet that needed to be finished by 5 and a coffee that had gone cold 2 hours ago, when she realized she could not remember the last time she had gone outside and just stood somewhere without needing to be somewhere else in 45 minutes. She couldn't remember the last time she had looked at something and not thought about what it was worth or what it would cost or whether it fit the plan. She couldn't remember the last time she had felt anything other than the specific low-grade exhaustion of a person who is doing everything right and feels nothing about it. That was when her phone rang. The number was a Vermont area code she didn't recognize. She almost didn't answer. She had developed the habit of not answering unknown numbers the way you develop all city habits. Quietly, practically, without noticing until the habit was already part of you. She answered on the 4th ring. The man on the other end spoke slowly, the way people speak in places where there is no particular reason to rush. He told her that a property had been registered in her name following the death of its previous owner, an elderly woman who had passed 6 weeks earlier at the age of 93. He told her the woman had left a letter along with the deed. He told her she would need to come to Vermont to collect both. She looked at her screen. The spreadsheet was half finished. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, Chicago was doing what Chicago does in October. Gray sky, cold lake, wind coming off the water like it had a personal grievance. "What kind of property?" she asked. "A cabin," he said, "on the lake. Been in the family since 1948. She wrote the address on a Post-it note and stuck it to the edge of her monitor and looked at it for the rest of the afternoon. At 4:30, her manager called her into a conference room and told her the team was being restructured and her position was being eliminated effective the following Friday. She nodded. She said she understood. She walked back to her desk and looked at the Post-it note. By Friday, she had packed everything she owned into 2 bags and a rolling suitcase. By the following Tuesday, she was standing on a dirt path in Vermont, pulling her city suitcase over ground it was not designed for, looking at the most beautiful and most neglected thing she had ever seen. The cabin sat at the edge of the lake the way old things sit in old places, not placed there so much as grown there, slowly and without asking permission. It was small, 1 story, maybe 600 square feet, with a covered porch that sagged at the left end and a roof so thoroughly colonized by moss it had gone entirely green. Ivy had claimed the left wall from foundation to roofline. Wild grass and white wildflowers had taken the path from the dirt road to the porch steps. The paint on the wooden walls had given up years ago, leaving the boards bare and darkened with decades of rain and cold. Behind the cabin, through the gap between the structure and the tree line, the lake was perfectly still and the color of old silver. The forest on the far bank reflected in it so precisely it was difficult to tell where the trees ended and the water began. She stood on the path and did not move for a long time. She was wearing a blazer. She had driven 4 hours in a blazer and clean white sneakers because those were the clothes she owned. The clothes of a person who went to offices and presentations and after-work drinks at rooftop bars. She looked at the cabin, and the cabin looked back, and somewhere in that exchange something shifted in her chest, the way things shift when you recognize something you didn't know you had been looking for. The county clerk had given her 2 things that morning: the deed, which had her name on it in the plain, factual language of legal documents, and a letter in a sealed envelope addressed in careful handwriting. She had held the letter in her lap for the entire drive and left it on the passenger seat when she got out. She wasn't sure why. Maybe she needed to see the cabin first. Maybe she needed to understand the gift before she understood the reason for it. She walked toward the porch. The steps held under her weight, which surprised her, soft at the edges but solid at the center. The porch creaked but did not give. The front door opened with a small brass key on a plain ring, and she pushed it and stepped inside. The air was cold and still and smelled like wood and old fabric and the particular sweetness of a space that has been closed for a long time. A single large room with a low ceiling and exposed beams. A stone fireplace occupied most of the north wall. A kitchen counter ran along the east wall with a cast-iron sink and open wooden shelves. A narrow bed frame stood against the west wall beneath a small window. A table and 2 chairs sat in the center of the room. A braided rug, faded beyond its original color, covered most of the floor. On the mantel above the fireplace was a framed photograph. A young woman in summer clothes standing on this same porch, squinting into the sun and laughing at whoever was holding the camera. Written on the back in pencil, July 1952. She held the photograph for a long time. Then she went back to the car and got the letter. She read it sitting on the porch steps with the lake visible through the gap in the trees and the sound of water moving the way lake water moves in October, slow and cold and unhurried. The woman who had written it explained that she had known her grandmother for 40 years, that they had been the kind of friends who told each other things they told no one else. She wrote that she had no children and no family left to speak of. She wrote that the cabin had been built by her father in the summer of 1948, and that she had loved it her entire life and had not been able to visit for 3 years because her body had stopped cooperating with her intentions. She wrote that she could have left it to the county. She had thought about that. But the county would sell it, and someone would build something new, and the lake wouldn't care, but she would, wherever she ended up. She wrote that she had heard about the young woman through her grandmother, that she had left Vermont for the city because she believed that was where her life was supposed to happen. She understood that, she wrote. She had done the same thing in 1955. She had gone to Boston and worked in an office and worn good shoes and been miserable for 11 years before she came back. She was not telling her what to do. She was past the age of thinking she knew what other people should do with their lives. She was just saying the cabin was hers if she wanted it, and if she didn't want it, sell it. But look at the fireplace first. Look at what was underneath the hearthstone on the left side. It had been loose since 1987 when her father had hidden something there and then forgotten he had done it. She had found it after he died. She had decided to leave it for whoever came next. Take care of the lake. It has been taking care of us for a long time. She read the letter twice. Then she folded it and held it in both hands and looked at the lake for a long time without thinking about anything in particular. It was the first time she had done that in as long as she could remember. The hearthstone on the left side of the fireplace was a flat piece of granite about 18 inches square, set into the floor at the base of the hearth. She found the looseness immediately, running her hand along the edge. A slight give, the specific movement of a stone that had been lifted and replaced many times over many decades. She worked it free with a flathead screwdriver from a kitchen drawer, sliding the blade into the gap and levering slowly until the stone lifted cleanly. Underneath was a space about 8 inches deep, lined with a piece of oilcloth dried and cracked with age. Inside were 3 things. The first was a small tin box. Inside it were coins. Old silver coins, mercury dimes, and standing Liberty quarters, 31 of them, each dated between 1916 and 1945. They had not been collected carelessly. Each one was wrapped in a small square of cloth, individual and deliberate, the work of someone who understood what they were saving and why. The second was a hand-drawn map of the lake and the surrounding land, property lines marked in pencil, a legend in the corner in careful handwriting. Several areas of the surrounding forest were marked with small symbols, an X, a circle, a triangle. She didn't know yet what they meant, but she understood they meant something. The third was a small leather notebook, its cover soft with age, the spine cracked from years of opening and closing. Inside, in the same careful handwriting as the map, were notes going back to the 1940s. Plant observations, weather records, fish counts. The water level of the lake recorded every spring and fall for 40 years. Notes on the birds that nested along the north bank. notes on a beaver dam that appeared in 1963 and was gone by 1971. Notes on the ice, when it came and when it went, how thick it ran, whether the winter had been hard or soft. It was a record of the lake. 40 years of paying careful attention to one place. She sat on the floor beside the open hearthstone and read until the light through the small windows went from gold to gray, and then she lit the oil lamp she had found on the kitchen shelf and kept reading. She called her mother that night from the porch, wrapped in a blanket from the cedar chest at the foot of the bed, the lake dark and still below the tree line. Her mother was quiet for a long time after she finished explaining. "I haven't heard that name since your grandmother's funeral," her mother said finally. "You knew her?" "I knew of her. Your grandmother loved her, said she was the most practical woman she'd ever met, the kind of person who fixed things instead of talking about them." She looked at the dark shape of the cabin behind her, the moss on the roof silver in the moonlight. "The roof needs work," she said. "Most things do," her mother said. "The porch is soft on the left side. The kitchen has no running water. The electrical looks like it was installed in 1962 and updated never. Is the fireplace good?" She thought about the hearthstone, about the coins and the map and 40 years of observations in a leather notebook. "The fireplace is perfect," she said. Her mother was quiet again. Then, "Your grandmother always said you'd end up somewhere with water. She said you used to draw lakes when you were little, before you decided to be practical." She didn't remember that, but she believed it. She stayed 3 days that first visit, sleeping in the narrow bed under 3 blankets, learning the fireplace, walking the lakeshore in the mornings with the notebook open in her hands, matching the old man's observations to what she could see now, where the beaver dam had been, where the North Bank birds still nested, where the water level markers he had scratched into a particular lakeside rock told the story of 60 years of seasons. On the second morning, a man appeared at the edge of the property. He was in his late 60s, heavy-set, wearing rubber boots and carrying a fishing rod. He stopped when he saw her and looked at the cabin and then back at her with an expression that was not unfriendly but was measuring. "You, the one who got the cabin?" he asked. "I am." He nodded slowly. "Edna talked about you. Said a young woman was coming." He looked at the cabin again. "Roof needs work." I know a man in town does roofs. Does good work, reasonable." He paused. "I'm Garrett. I fish this lake every morning. Have for 30 years. What do you catch?" He smiled for the first time. "Depends on the morning. Come out at 6 tomorrow and I'll show you." She was at the lake shore at 6 the next morning. Garrett was already there, 2 rods set up, coffee in a thermos he shared without being asked. He showed her where the fish ran in October, which channels they followed when the water cooled, where the old man whose notebook she had been reading used to set his line 40 years ago. "He was a serious man," Garrett said. "Didn't talk much, but he knew this lake better than anyone alive." He looked at her sideways. "You read his notebook?" "Every page." Garrett was quiet for a moment. Then he nodded, the way people nod when something is confirmed that they had hoped but not assumed. "Good," he said. She drove back to Chicago that third afternoon and spent 2 weeks closing down her life there with the methodical efficiency that had always been her strongest professional skill, now applied to something that actually mattered to her. She gave up the apartment. She sold the furniture except for 3 boxes of books and a lamp her grandmother had given her. She put everything else in her car and drove north. The town of Harwick had a hardware store, a diner, a post office, and a library that was open 3 days a week. It had a population of just over 800 people, most of whom knew within 48 hours that someone had moved into the Callaway cabin on the lake. They came in the way small-town people come, not all at once, not with fanfare, but one at a time, with practical offerings. The woman who ran the diner appeared one morning with a cast-iron skillet and a jar of preserved blueberries, and the information that the cabin's well pump had a particular quirk that required a specific sequence of priming, or it would run dry. A retired carpenter named Sully knocked on the door 2 days after that and spent 4 hours on the roof without being asked, patching the worst sections and leaving a careful written estimate for the full replacement that he said could wait until spring if she kept the patches dry. A woman about her own age named Petra, who worked at the library, showed up on a Saturday with a bag of apples from her family's orchard and stayed for 3 hours, first helping stack firewood and then sitting at the table drinking tea and asking careful questions. Not the intrusive questions of a person extracting information, but the genuine questions of someone who wanted to understand. "Why here?" Petra asked. "I mean, really. The city people who come up here usually want to renovate everything. Put in heated floors, put in a wine fridge." She thought about how to answer. She thought about the 31st floor and the color-coded 5-year plan and the spreadsheet that had been half-finished when everything changed. She thought about sitting on the porch steps reading a letter from a woman she had never met who had understood something about her that she hadn't understood about herself. "I think I needed to be somewhere that already knew what it was," she said finally. "I spent 2 years trying to figure out who I was supposed to become, and then I came here, and everything already had a name and a history and a reason for being where it was. The lake knows what it is. The cabin knows what it is." She paused. "I thought maybe if I paid attention long enough I'd figure out what I am, too." Petra looked at her for a moment. "Edna used to say something like that," she said. "She said the cabin was the most honest place she'd ever been. Said it never pretended to be anything it wasn't." The symbols on the map took her 3 weeks to decode. The X marks indicated old apple trees, wild varieties that had been growing on the property and the adjacent land since before anyone living could remember. Their fruit small and irregular and intensely flavored in a way that commercial apples had bred out of existence. There were 7 of them, marked with the X, and she found each one by following the map through the woods on a cold November morning, standing beneath branches still holding the last of their fruit. The circles marked springs, natural freshwater springs emerging from the hillside above the lake, 3 of them, their water cold and clear. The old man had noted their flow rates in the notebook, season by season, and she could see from his records that they had been consistent for 40 years, reliable as anything in that landscape. The triangles were the most unexpected. They marked stands of old-growth timber, trees that had never been logged tucked into the back corners of the property where no logging operation had ever found it economical to go. White pines and sugar maples 4 and 5 feet in diameter, their canopy so dense the forest floor beneath them was almost bare. She stood among them on the afternoon she found them and put her hand on the nearest trunk and felt the specific solidity of something very old and very permanent. She was beginning to understand the inheritance. It was not the cabin. The cabin was just the door. The inheritance was the knowledge of what was here. The springs and the old trees and the apple varieties and the fish channels and the water levels and all of it recorded in a leather notebook by a man who had paid attention for 40 years. She had been left not just a place but a way of seeing a place. Winter came early that year. By late November, the lake had a thin skin of ice at the edges that thickened through December until it was solid enough to walk on, which Garrett demonstrated one morning by walking out 50 feet from shore and turning to wave at her where she stood watching from the bank. She had insulated the cabin properly by then. Closed cell foam in the walls where the old insulation had failed, new weather stripping on every door and window, a cord and a half of split wood stacked under the porch roof. Sully had come back with 2 other men and replaced the worst section of the roof in a single long Saturday, refusing payment beyond lunch and the use of her kitchen to warm up. She had no income. She had savings that would last, if she was careful, through the spring. She was not worried about this in the way she would have been 2 months ago, which itself was a change worth noting. She had started keeping her own notebook, not a copy of the old man's observations, but a continuation of them. The same lake, the same seasons, the same attention. She recorded the ice dates. She recorded the first snow. She recorded what the apple trees looked like in November when everything else was bare, their gnarled branches holding a few last wrinkled fruits that the birds came for every morning. She had sent photographs of the apple varieties to an agricultural extension office in Burlington, on Petra's suggestion, and received back a response from a botanist who drove up from Burlington on a Thursday specifically to look at the trees. He stood beneath the largest one for a long time and then turned to her with an expression she recognized, the expression of someone who has found something they had been looking for without knowing they were looking for it. "This variety," he said, "hasn't been documented in Vermont since 1987. We thought it was gone." She showed him the notebook. He sat at her kitchen table and read for 2 hours, occasionally making notes of his own. When he left, he shook her hand with both of his and said that what she had on this property was not just a cabin on a lake. He said she was sitting on something that mattered to people who cared about these things, and that those people would want to know about it, and that knowing about it had value she had not yet begun to understand. By February, she had 3 sources of income that had not existed in October. The first was a small preservation grant from the State Agricultural Office, connected to the apple trees and the springs, and what the botanist had described in his report as a rare intact example of pre-industrial New England landscape ecology. The grant was not large, but it was consistent, and it came with technical support, people who knew things she needed to know. The second came from Petra, who had mentioned to the library board that the property held an extraordinary collection of handwritten natural history observations spanning 4 decades, and the library board had mentioned it to the Historical Society, and the Historical Society had offered a modest annual stipend in exchange for access to the notebook and permission to create an archive. The third was unexpected. She had started writing about the cabin, not for any particular audience, just for herself, the way she had started the notebook, a record of what she was learning, what she was doing, what the lake looked like in January when the ice was thick and the snow was deep, and the world had gone quiet in the way the world goes quiet in northern winters. She had posted some of it online without thinking too carefully about it, and people had found it and kept finding it and writing to her about it in the way that people write when something has said something true to them. She was not making a living from any of these things individually. Together, carefully managed, they were enough. In March, the ice went out of the lake in a single afternoon, which Garrett had told her to watch for. He said it happened fast when it happened, that one day the lake was solid, and the next it was open water, and you could miss it if you weren't paying attention. She was paying attention. She was at the lake shore when the ice began to move, standing in the cold March light watching the sheet break apart and drift and disappear into open water, and she wrote the date in her notebook the way the old man had written it every year, in the same column, part of the same record. She thought about the woman who had written her the letter. She thought about a young woman leaving Vermont for the city in 1955 in good shoes, certain that was where her life was supposed to happen, and coming back 11 years later to a cabin on a lake that had been waiting exactly as she had left it. She thought about her grandmother, who had apparently known something about her that she hadn't known about herself, who had kept a friendship for 40 years with a woman who paid attention to springs and apple trees and ice dates, and who had somehow arranged, without arranging anything, for the right thing to find the right person at the right time. She thought about the coins under the hearthstone, each one wrapped in a small square of cloth, the care of that, the deliberateness, a man saving something worth saving in the only way available to him, and trusting that whoever found it would understand why. Some things are built to last. Some places know what they are. Some inheritances are not about money or property or legal documents. They are about a way of paying attention, passed from one person to the next like a stone lifted and replaced, until it finds the hands it was meant for. She closed the notebook. The lake was open and cold and the color of the March sky, and a pair of ducks she hadn't seen before were working the far shore, and somewhere in the woods behind the cabin the first red-winged blackbird of the year was making its particular noise, which she recognized from the old man's notes as the reliable signal that the season had turned. She wrote that down too. She was 24 years old. She had left a life that fit perfectly and meant nothing, and had arrived at a place that was broken in every practical sense and felt more right than anything she had ever chosen deliberately. That is the thing about the places that are meant for you. They don't announce themselves. They don't appear on 5-year plans or color-coded spreadsheets. They arrive as a phone call from an area code you don't recognize, on an afternoon when you are tired in a way that sleep doesn't fix, and they ask only that you answer. She had answered. The lake was open. The season had turned. There was work to do. Take care of the lake. It has been taking care of us for a long time. She kept that line on a piece of paper tucked into the front cover of her notebook, where she would see it every time she opened it. It was the best advice anyone had ever given her. And the most important thing about it was that it had come from someone she had never met, who had trusted, without any particular reason to trust, that the right person would find their way to the right place and know what to do when they got there. Some lights keep shining whether they're on the charts or not. Some doors open exactly when they're supposed to. Some things left behind are not lost at all. They are waiting.